Yeah, I'm trying to remember everything.
Throughout this extraordinary experience, one of the most important things we've needed is information about what we're discovering and what else we can do to keep safe. Thankfully, there've been trusted experts who are sharing the knowledge needed to help protect New Zealanders and keep our country moving, even when it felt like the world had stopped. And many of these people are our people. It's a privilege to be playing our part. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, kia kaha Aotearoa.
So, hello, Otago University. How is the weather in New Zealand?
It's been a fantastic day here today, about 20 degrees, warm and sunny, and not a place to be inside a studio.
Brilliant. So, we're looking forward to your debate. Over to you.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to presenting. So we're at Otago University, we're in Dunedin, New Zealand, right down the south of the world. I'm joined here today by some fantastic students from the university. We've got Charlotte, Liam, Kate, Melissa and Emily, and we're going to talk to you about New Zealand and its place in American politics, how we're affected by American politics. We'll talk a little bit about the Pacific and how different strategic maneuvers between China and the US cause tensions on the peoples and cultures there. And also a little bit about climate change, which is obviously a topic close to many New Zealanders' hearts and, you know, the multilateral responses and initiatives to them. New Zealand is a pretty interesting country. We're obviously a very small state located in the South Pacific. There's about 5 million of us. And we do tend to try and exert a bigger force on the international stage than perhaps our small size would normally give credence to. In terms of relations with America, it's been a bit of a hodgepodge over our relatively short history. We sort of split off from American relations in the 80s with our strong non-nuclear proliferation stance, which was slowly brought back and relations were slowly repaired under the Clark administration and the more recent Key administration with our involvement, however wrongly, in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. So tonight we're going to start off our conversation with an introductory video from Dr. Lara Greaves at AUT up in the North Island. And she's going to discuss how New Zealand politics and domestic politics especially are affected by the American discourse. So this is Dr. Lara Greaves.
We're joined here with Dr. Lara Greaves of AUT. Lara, New Zealand has obviously just completed its own election, with the incumbent Labour Party securing a resounding success through a campaign based on empathy and compassion, which seems in stark contrast to much of what we see in the media about the US election. What contrasts or similarities were there between the two elections, and how have US politics been understood by New Zealanders?
I think American politics in New Zealand is really this like huge contrast for voters and for New Zealanders. So New Zealanders kind of look at our politics and they look at Ardern's politics of kindness and the sort of empathy and the sort of rhetoric that Ardern has adopted through her campaigns and through COVID-19. And we look at ourselves and then we look at it in contrast to American politics quite starkly. I think a lot of our media that we get is from America. A lot of, say, like even our New Zealand politics students know more about American politics than they do about New Zealand politics. So it's one of those natural comparisons along those lines. So generally we also compare ourselves to Australian and UK politics, but those seem less exciting and there's less sort of TV shows for sort of people to watch and follow. So I think that a lot of people in terms of the American election is that they've kind of, and because the two elections have run alongside one another, people have kind of looked at our politics like sort of potentially like less negative, there being less money in our politics, and the sort of less adversarial, potentially more listening to experts and being a little bit more policy focused. Look, they've looked at our politics, they contrast it to American politics, and I think it creates a little bit of a maybe smugness or superiority complex at times as well. I think that's really how New Zealanders look at American politics.
Thank you very much. Trump has had an alarming impact on democratic norms around the world, both through his support of autocratic regimes abroad and his deliberate attempts to undermine voter confidence in electoral systems at home. While the consequences of these actions are still being processed all around the world, do you have any insights into whether or not this has impacted on New Zealand's election and politics?
I think potentially what happens in New Zealand politics is that New Zealand politics and people who kind of almost self-styled political operatives, right? They look to see what America's doing, and they look to see what you could potentially apply to New Zealand context. I think that generally research has shown that in New Zealand that the left also tries to enfranchise more people and the right tends to disenfranchise more. We saw that a lot over the sort of prisoner voting rights. And if you were in prison for up to 3 years, your right to vote has recently been restored by the Labour government after National Private Members Bill through National took it away. So, and we've seen more people be enfranchised through being able to enrol and vote on election day through the left. I think that's potentially a tactic that, like a right-leaning government could take down the road in New Zealand. I think we're still quite a while away from A, there being a right-wing government, and B, there being one with the sort of political will to do that. I think where we had maybe some kind of more right-wing kind of overseas influence kind of conspiracy theorist type of right party sort of to the right of someone like National, that would be when that would drag that way. And so we're really kind of waiting to see if we do get some of those sort of like anti-minority populist movement to a greater extent that would cause any kind of erosion of democratic rights, but I can't necessarily see it happening with Labour in power and in such a position of strength. And I think that's partially a timing issue in New Zealand as well.
Lastly, the 2016 election shocked political pundits around the world who failed to predict the ability of Trump to connect with vulnerable communities, to garner and even now maintain support. Have New Zealand parties utilised similar tactics to Trump, or have we seen a shift by vulnerable communities across New Zealand to these more conservative or even authoritarian types of politics?
I think there's just generally in terms of like diverse identity groups there are and people that are like from marginalised communities, I think there are pockets within any marginalised community that happens to prioritise different policy issues, right? So we look like, say, within Māori, there are groups within Māori that prioritise like socioeconomic concerns and tax and small business over like Māori and Māori rights issues as their fundamental group level issues. So I think that happens across a lot of our groups. Some of my research kind of shows that happening with Māori and shows it happening with gay men in particular, that those sort of that broader identity gets overridden by other concerns in terms of policy concerns, and they prioritise different parts of their identity. I think that in terms of the sort of populist influence on New Zealand politics, we have seen, and we saw it over the 2020 campaign, just different sort of threads of sort of anti-masking and maybe like stuff relating to sort of the gendered bathrooms and along those lines. We've seen bits and pieces be picked up through, say, the New Conservative Party, through Advance New Zealand and through Vision New Zealand to a certain extent. We've seen threads being picked up from American politics and from American campaigners. I think that's where, again, that how easy it is for New Zealanders to connect to American politics and connect to American media and social media. I think that ease can cause sort of vulnerabilities there for people to sort of adopt those sorts of ideologies from overseas, and to be that group or that within the group that is kind of a bit contrarian and a bit kind of rejects any kind of paternalism, or kind of says, you know, I'm not my ethnicity, or I'm not this, or I'm not that, and people who are within that, say, ethnic identity group then go and adopt stuff from overseas. And I think we've seen a little bit of that happening. in terms of the success of the New Conservatives and of Advance New Zealand, they didn't do very well in the end. But I think that ultimately at the moment, on the right in New Zealand, there are a lot of minor parties all fighting for voters, and there are a lot of voters that are staying home. And some of our analyses of the New Zealand election study show this. And so there are different pockets that could be potentially united into a right-wing movement that could potentially become a minor party in New Zealand in the future.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. That was Dr. Lara Greaves of AUT getting us an update on how New Zealand was impacted by the American election. For our overseas audiences, you may not be aware, but we've recently had our own historic election, which was won by a left-leaning Jacinda Ardern, who's been popping up in headlines around the world for her politics of compassion and empathy. Slight difference to the election in America right now. To kick off this segment, I'd like to discuss with Liam briefly about how the American political system has impacted our own democracy here. So, Liam, what are some of the differing perspectives of New Zealanders about the American election? And were we influenced in any way by their tactics, by their campaign stories and motives?
Yeah, well, I think all around the world, as you said, we've just come out of this election, so it's hugely exciting. I was quite involved in the New Zealand election here, so it's quite exciting to come into another election and be involved in this way and look at what's happening there. So all around the world, whatever elections are happening this year, they're all focused on COVID and COVID recovery. And the US are in a totally different position to what we're in right now in New Zealand. So I don't think we're taking too much from their gains or lack thereof. We had a policy of stamping it out and getting rid of the virus completely. So that's what we've done, and we've been relatively successful at it, actually. But conservatism, that's a big thing that's been happening all around the world, and it's been something that we've noticed quite a lot in New Zealand. We're, as you said, a relatively progressive country and left-leaning governments. Even when we have the centre-right governments in power, it's still pretty progressive compared to the US and some of the policy stances that they have. So I think that's something that's influenced us not only as a country but as individuals as well. I think it's sometimes a little bit of a culture shock to see some of these views that are being put on TV and CNN and Fox News and the likes. I think it's quite a big contrast and a shock to a lot of us to see also the widespread misinformation that's been happening in the US elections. We've been relatively lucky here in New Zealand that we haven't had that widespread misinformation, but we have had it to a degree. We've just had two referendums, one for euthanasia and one for the cannabis control and regulation bill, which are two progressive things that came through. One was successful, the euthanasia, and there was actually a lot of misinformation going around on social media, TV ads, print media. So that was, I think that was quite shocking for a lot of us to think, oh, this happens here. You know, this happens in our country where we feel relatively protected, I should say. But on the big scale, we are a small country, so we do have a bit of influence and get influenced by bigger countries such as the US. We have about $42 billion in exports a year, and that stayed pretty concrete throughout COVID, and we haven't been too affected in that way, which is really great for our country. But the outcome of this election will determine how that goes in the future, because Trump's taking a stance of America first and make America great again. And the way that they're doing that is by making sure that American-made goods are being produced there where possible, and making sure that they have what he's calling a fair multilateral or trade agreements and things like that, which is fair enough for the country, but that will have effects on our country here right now. But, you know, under the Trump presidency, tensions have accelerated all around the world, no matter what their agreements be. But although the COVID surge in the US has actually been beneficial to New Zealand, because they don't produce as much. They have to have certain regulations in their factories. which means that we export a lot more to different countries, and certain countries we don't export to, but it's balanced out relatively well. But the US is New Zealand's third largest exporter destination, and the country takes around 10% of our exports, which include meat, dairy, fish, and all that sort of thing. So in terms of how we've been affected, we kind of not only get influenced by what they're doing, but also we kind of look at, do we want to do that? Do we want to lead by the same? And we kind of flip it on its head and do things differently to what they're doing. So not only is it, do we take the good things from what they're doing, but we also learn from their bad things. But in terms of how New Zealand is actually affected by their policies, I think that we take a much different stance to foreign policy and how we treat aid as well. You know, right here in the Pacific, where we're based, we feel like we have a duty of care to our brothers in the region, and so we protect them in that way. And obviously, we'll be talking about climate change and how that's affected, and also in the Pacific later on. But right now, the big things that we're facing are climate change and COVID-19, and there's not going to be any fix to that unless we have some sort of multilateral solutions to that, and we work together to come up with these solutions, because that's the only way that we're going to do it. So whoever the next president is going to have a large impact on New Zealand's and the world's fight against these two problems, either for the best or for the worst.
Thank you very much, Liam. Some interesting comments, and I understand the sort of multilateral system, and we'll get into that a bit later. I'm wondering, Kate or Liam, perhaps, a lot of the rhetoric that comes out of the US administration is specifically targeted towards minorities and vulnerable communities to try and get them on board. You hear, you know, Trump saying that he's the most least racist person in a room full of white people, and things like that, and some very sort of confusing statements. And in our own election cycle, we had some of our more minor conservative right-wing parties leaning heavily on the US apparatus, in fact, inviting guest speakers from Breitbart and things like that to speak on the radio. Kate, do you feel like that had any impact on our politics? Will it have an impact in the future? How can we prevent this sort of malicious narratives from breaching our news cycle?
I think the first thing that we probably should acknowledge is that New Zealanders tend to be inquisitive people and tend to be pretty good at nullifying what is not true for a start. But as well, New Zealand's quite isolated in the sense that geographically, but also through news media, right? We have two main news channels. In the US, there's tens of dozens of news channels. So that kind of narrows down that misinformation that's coming through to start with. But I think also what we're starting to see in terms of our politics is that, you know, we're not like the UK, we're not like the US, we don't have a populist government per se, right? And so what that shows is that New Zealanders do tend to question what's put in front of them and make sure that it is true. But I do think that there is an issue going forward with globalization and technology, that misinformation can start coming through to our airwaves. But we have to be aware that it's probably already happening. Australia recently came out and said that they had interference by a state actor into their own elections and into, in particular, some of their top businesses and trade. So we need to start thinking about, well, how are we going to do that on our own stock exchange, for example, that was shut down twice or 3 times. So what we need to start being more aware of is it might not be the people, but also our government and institutions as well that need to start looking towards how we're going to fix that. But at the same time, I think that most countries, instead of at the moment, view New Zealand as a good ally to have. And I think that's quite an important aspect to think about too.
Excellent. Yeah, I think one thing that New Zealand obviously benefits from is its small size. And so we are able to legislate a lot quicker than some of these bigger countries. And we see that over after the mass shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand was able to push through some legislation, both in terms of gun control, but also in terms of Facebook and Twitter and social streaming and things like that. Liam, I was just wondering whether or not you would have any comments about that legislation, or perhaps Kate.
Yeah, so it was actually quite renowned that we managed to push this legislation through. It's pretty progressive to be able to ban semi-automatic assault rifles in such a short amount of time, and to also have the support of the whole House, bar one member. is pretty incredible as well. So I think we were put on the international stage right there as a beacon of hope. You know, we reacted to a horrible situation that happened in our country, and we wanted to take a stance that would make sure that that doesn't happen again. And we learned from other people's mistakes as well. You know, Australia had done a similar act when they had a mass shooting there. I think it was in the 80s or the 90s. So we're able to look at other people's legislation and look at what works and what doesn't. And that's something that I think all New Zealanders can be proud of. And we're not too polarised. You know, we look at this issue overseas, especially in the States. It's a really polarising issue about the right to bear arms. Obviously, it's in their constitution as well. But it's a scary thing, I think, for New Zealanders to think about.
Excellent. Thank you very much. To pick up on your earlier comments before about multilateralism, that's actually going to be our next segment. So we'll just launch into that now, putting the time into perspective. So multilateralism is obviously the system of rules and norms that New Zealand governs itself upon the international stage. And our next video segment is with Professor Robert Patman of the University of Otago in the politics department. He's a pretty big face around New Zealand, and some people overseas might recognize him as well. And he's about to give us a 5 or 6 minute interview about how New Zealand uses the rules-based order to conduct its foreign policy. So this is Professor Robert Patman.
We're joined now by Professor Robert Patman. Thank you very much.
No, it's a pleasure.
So the first question is really sort of getting an understanding of how the Trump administration has affected New Zealand's ability to conduct itself on the world stage. Especially, like, what would the likely consequences of a Trump re-election be for New Zealand?
I would say quite significantly, although I would say that New Zealand has been quite nimble in its response to the Trump administration. It's pursued what might be called a two-track approach to the Trump administration. On the one track, it's tried to identify those areas where it can collaborate with the Trump administration. On the other hand, the second track, I think New Zealand has not made any apologies or any attempt to agree with the worldview of the Trump administration. And that takes me to the fundamental challenge which the Trump administration brings to countries like New Zealand and many other liberal democracies, as well as middle-sized states. And that is that Trump is a populist in power. Populists in power do not accept an international rules-based system. So what we've had since Trump has been in power has been an unprecedented erosion of the liberal order, or sometimes called the international rules-based order, on which the national interests of New Zealand critically depend. We're not big enough to make our own rules. Therefore, like the majority of countries in the international system, we need international institutions to boost our sovereignty. Unfortunately, this is an administration which views the world in zero-sum terms. It sees institutions like the WTO, the UN, NATO as a constraint on American sovereignty rather than something which complements it. And so, in a sense, New Zealand has managed to navigate the deteriorating relationship between the Trump administration and China quite nimbly. But I think there will be a major test if Mr. Trump gets re-elected, because I think Mr. Trump would be expected by his followers, at least, to deepen the approach that he's already taken. And I think already we're seeing real assaults on the New Zealand national interests, not just Mr. Trump being sympathetic to white nationalism. And of course, we saw the results of that in Christchurch in March 15th, 2019. President Trump, for example, awarded the Medal of Presidential Freedom to Rush Limbaugh, a radio host who 7 hours after the appalling events in Christchurch said it was a left-wing false flag operation designed to discredit the riot. So yeah, I think it will become tougher. if for New Zealand, but New Zealand's in a good position because I think it can ride out a Trump administration, but I think there'll be more challenges on the way. If Mr. Trump does get re-elected, I think New Zealand and many other small actors and middle-sized actors are going to have to get out the habit of being passive, because the original architects of the rules-based system on which we depend in this country, the UK and the United States, are both have populists in power, who are both of them effectively turning their back on that era. So we have to protect our national interests, and therefore Jacinda Ardern may have to use her international political capital to start speaking up for issues that are in our national interest.
It sounds pretty bleak. How would things differ under a Biden administration? Would everything go back to a pre-2016 normal, or would we have new challenges to face?
Things won't go back to the status quo. I think we're in an international transition at the moment, in which, and one of the trends of the transition of the post-Cold War era is that great powers can't run the world. They are more vulnerable, they're more interdependent than great powers of the past. That's not because they're weaker. In fact, they're more powerful than great powers of the past. It's just that they're in a ring space now, which is more interconnected, more complex, and most challenges states face cannot be solved unilaterally, as COVID-19 has demonstrated. I do think, however, having said that, that a Biden administration would be significantly more, from a New Zealand point of view, would be open up the prospect for much deeper cooperation between New Zealand and the United States. In the second of the two debates between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden made two things very clear, which I think was music to New Zealand ears. Firstly, Mr. Biden is forward-leaning on climate change, which is something that the current Prime Minister of New Zealand also wants to see action on. And he indicated that he would be looking to accelerate a change in the energy paradigm in the United States away from an oil-based economy. Secondly, Mr. Biden indicated that he wants America to become much more proactive in tackling COVID-19. This deadly disease has ravaged the United States, more than 220,000 Americans dead, which is the highest death toll for any individual country in the world. And we had, within the last 7 days, the revelation by Mr. Trump's Chief of Staff, Mike Meadows, that the administration is no longer trying to control the pandemic. So I think on COVID-19 and climate change, two problems which do not respect borders, we would have an administration in Washington under Mr. Biden, which New Zealand could work with. But I think, the answer to your original question is yes and no, or no and yes. And I don't think there's any return to the past, but I think there's every prospect that New Zealand could have a much more productive relationship with the Biden administration than the Trump one.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your comments and for joining us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the election show. You
too. All the best. Cheers, Aidan.
So that was Professor Robert Patman of the Politics Department here at Otago University. I've just been told that we've got a news update coming in, so we're going to switch over to the studio in Wales. Over to you.
Good evening. I've been monitoring media reports for you, and I would like to present the latest update on where we are in the election. All states has closed their polling stations already. John Biden is currently live speaking that he believes he's on the track to win the election. Donald Trump and Joe Biden each need 270 electoral college votes to win the presidency. According to CNN, currently Joe Biden is taking 215 electoral votes, while President Donald Trump is taking 136. CNN has also reported that Biden won the key state of New Hampshire, while Trump has held onto reliable red states. According to the CNN projection, President Trump wins the key states Florida, the Mississippi, Missouri, and Wyoming. For Biden, it seems to be Minnesota, Virginia, Washington State, Colorado, and New Mexico. Let's have a look on the situation in the swing states. According to CNN, it seems that North Carolina may be the most competitive state in the election. John Biden is currently leading President Trump in North Carolina with 80% of the estimated vote. But this relates mostly to early votes, and it can be changed because election votes could benefit Trump. It is still too early to comment on the result in 6 swing states, which are likely to decide who is the next president. However, CNN delivers an interesting story from Arizona, the border state with 11 electoral votes voted Republicans since 1957. The only exception was when Bill Clinton won the state in 1996. This year, however, there is a possibility to see a Democratic shift, which can make Biden the second Democrat in history who will take the state. This is due to a growing Latino population and an influx of voters from more rural areas, which tend to support Democrats. Into November the 3rd, Biden headed with a lead in the polls in Arizona. Currently, CNN projection is showing that he is holding the leading position with 53.6%. For President Trump, it would be 45%. This state is also home to one of the most hotly contested Senate competitions, where Democratic candidate Mark Kelly is leading in his Senate race against Republican Martha McSally. We can continue in our tour through swing states, heading to Pennsylvania, one of the most important battlegrounds where we still don't know a lot about the results because they started counting the votes just on the election day. Pennsylvania has 20 electoral college votes, which Trump won in 2016. But now it is a state of a huge interest of Joe Biden. It may be worth to mention that the former vice president was born there, so he paid lots of attention to this state as he committed to rebuild the blue value which Donald Trump broke in 2016. Trump visited Pennsylvania 13 times while Biden made 16 trips. Both were there on the eve of the election. Currently, it seems to be 41.8% of votes for Biden, while Donald Trump is taking 56.9%. Except of the numbers and predictions, the media sources I've been monitoring highlighted also an interesting point. On November the 3rd, the US officially exits the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, which is a significant consequence of 4 years of President Trump in the office. An article written by Independent reminded that this day last year, the Trump administration formally notified the United Nations that it would withdraw after the required one-year waiting period. President Trump announced his intention to withdraw in June 2017, and Paris Accord aims to avoid dangerous climate change by dramatically reducing the global greenhouse gas emissions. I believe this is an important point to Otago, so it is all from me for now, more later, and we are heading back to you.
Thank you very much for that breaking news update. It's interesting for us sitting here on the panel because we can't keep watching our phones and seeing how the votes are going. So it's great for us to be updated as well. Just before that update, we had an interview by Professor Robert Patman on the rules-based order. And I'm going to now ask Kate if she can discuss a little bit about how New Zealand uses the rules-based order to assert its own interests on the world stage and what the effects of the Trump administration have been on that more directly, and would it look different for Biden?
Yes, thank you. So I just want to start off with the really basic concept that I think Professor Patman touched on. But the rules-based order severely helps small states. And I say severely because to large states, the rules-based order can be quite restrictive. So for New Zealand, we've really benefited having the rules-based order. So that's institutions like the UN, like the WTO, like WHO. It's given us more of an even playing field when it comes to trade and diplomacy. What we've seen with the Trump administration, I would say, is we've seen sort of a reversal in that liberalism, that globalization. We've seen the UK as well follow that trend of saying, hey, we're just going to take a step back and start reviewing not only our funding, but also our interaction in these institutions. For New Zealand, the breaking of the rules-based order breaks sort of norms. So that's the norms of using soft power and hard power. So for us, I think what we're going to see in the future is a lot of uncertainty, and that's not great for small states, and it's even worse for micro states like in the Pacific as well. You know, one of the things that the UN brings is for the South Pacific as well. It's a huge voting bloc. So when we have a large voting bloc, you see large states like China, like the US, like the UK, take an interest in making sure that when it comes to proposals being put forward, that the votes go in their favour. So what that means for us in particular is we're going to see a lot of interest and we're going to see a lot more exertion of hard and soft power. And for New Zealand, 5 million people, we don't have the same economy, we don't have the same military, we don't have that same ability to navigate that without, say, the WTO, for example. So I think what we're going to see with the Trump administration, if re-elected, is we're going to see more interest in the South Pacific in particular. Biden, maybe not so much, maybe a more collaborative approach with traditional allies like Five Eyes, for example. But I do think that there might be a bit more interest in sticking to that rules-based order.
Excellent. Very interesting points there. I think it's interesting to think that New Zealand or small states benefit immensely from the rules-based order when it was also set up by the big states in the aftermath of the Second World War. And a large part of that thinking, from my understanding, is simply that the US realized its power would wax and wane, and it wanted to set up a system that it would be able to benefit from even as it started to be sort of surpassed by other states. Some interesting comments there on trade. Emily, I wonder if you agree what trade would look like under a re-Trump administration.
I think it's quite interesting because in Trump's first term, we've seen an escalation of tensions between the United States and China, and this ongoing trade war could put pressure on New Zealand. And this is really important because China is New Zealand's largest export market. They brought in $11 billion last year. And the United States is New Zealand's third largest. They brought in just over $3 billion in 2019. And politically, because of this trade war, America's expectations may change and New Zealand may need to rethink their trading partners. And so this is a really interesting position for New Zealand to be put in. I'm not too sure if anything would change if Trump was re-elected under another term. It could just escalate even more. And Biden has stated that he would like smaller states to stand up to China, as many Americans believe China is their biggest threat. So it'll be interesting.
So China is one of New Zealand's main trading partners. America is one of New Zealand's main trading partners. It obviously leads to a bit of a confrontation, which we could find ourselves in the middle. I'm wondering, Kate, do you have any insight as to whether or not New Zealand's going to attempt to hedge its bets and maybe support one state over the other, or whether or not it will diversify its trade platform?
Well, I would love to be sitting in the Prime Minister's office right now to discuss that. But I think at the moment, what we are seeing is that recently with Hong Kong, New Zealand was quite late to the party when it came to Five Eyes and announcements on condemnation of that. Winston Peters has said, show me your diary to that, but we can say that political commentators alike did say it's been a bit late to the party. What we have seen is the United States in particular has taken quite an interest, despite the fact you've got a Trump administration who say, you know, we want to put America first. They have actually increased their presence in New Zealand, and they've also increased their presence in the Pacific. I know that there's been a $200 million further injection into the South Pacific. What do I see New Zealand doing? It's just speculation, to be honest. I think this new Labour government being able to be solo governing gives it a bit more flexibility to look at what is best for New Zealand. It would be quite interesting to see whether Biden or Trump, under whoever wins this election, does offer more trade to New Zealand. Because I think that's one of the things is that, yes, we're a country of 5 million people, but as Liam mentioned before, we've picked up a lot of slack in COVID. Whether that trade level stays the same, whether it peters out, is going to be a different issue there. And I guess that comes back to COVID as well. But how the United States recovers from COVID, how quickly, I think will determine how New Zealand, particularly in trade, will go forward. I do think it is quite interesting with China at the moment as well. It's clear that there's been quite a lot of interest in New Zealand again, and it doesn't come just from state, but it also comes from individuals and corporations as well. So yeah, speculation, but quite interesting, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Charlotte, we're going to talk about climate change and multilateralism a little bit in the future, but I just wanted to get your take. How does the rules-based system affect the multilateral response to climate change?
Well, as mentioned in Robert Petman's video, climate change is a global issue which does not respect national borders, sadly, where implications are unlinked from causes. So with President Trump's backing out of the central leadership position of the rules-based order and taking more of a populist position, this is a huge detriment to the global climate movement, as it lacks that central authority to unite smaller to medium-sized states like New Zealand. This was demonstrated under the Key government, where we took more of a fast follower approach, which pretty much stands that because our emissions are low proportion to global emissions, that we are going to step up once the big players, do their job, like China and the USA. However, this ideology offsets a domino effect of complacency. Therefore, perhaps, as Kate touched on before, perhaps responsibility lies in the hands of the private sector, with global, uncoordinated climate politics lacking that central authority. For example, we're already doing it with operations such as our carbon credit markets operate on a sector-by-sector basis. Within New Zealand, we can see that our sectors have really taken on sustainability principles on board, such as I have down here, Air New Zealand claiming to be the world's least unsustainable airline. Aviation exceptionalism, that's a whole nother topic, but also Fonterra issuing annual sustainability reports. But then, it sort of comes back to, is environmental capitalism an oxymoron, which from my point of view, the demands of capitalism in terms of exponential growth and extraction do not fit into the confines of a living planet, planetary boundaries. But that's just a bit of food for thought. Definitely an important dynamic, increasingly dictating global climate politics.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Charlotte. Some interesting insight there on the global order, and we'll come back to climate change in a couple of minutes. But first, we're going to talk about the Pacific, which is obviously a region exceptionally invested and affected by climate change and climate change policies, including the lack of leadership from the United States on climate change platforms and pulling out of the Paris Agreement and things like that. So our next video is with Professor Kevin Clements, who is the founding director of the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies here at Otago University. And he's going to discuss a bit about how the Trump administration has affected Pacific communities, which we'll then go into more detail after. So, Professor Kevin Clements.
We're joined now by Professor Kevin Clements. Kevin, New Zealand benefits from a host of multilateral partnerships which have been threatened by the Trump administration. This also includes things such as security arrangements like the Five Eyes intelligence sharing community, which New Zealand partakes in. How might a Biden administration seek to reorient these relations and improve connectivity between traditional partners?
If Biden wins the election, he's going to have a huge number of different challenges confronting him. in relation to foreign policy, the first thing he's going to have to do is to reinstate the kind of numbers of diplomats in the State Department and expand its fact-gathering capacity and so forth. He'll do the same with the intelligence services. Whether that will mean an enhanced role for America and Five Eyes and so forth, I just don't know at this stage. He'll certainly want to make sure that whatever evidence is gleaned there will be fed into evidence-based foreign policy making. But in terms of dirty tricks side of things, Biden, I think, will be much more careful than Trump to make sure that the U.S. is abiding by some basic conventions in relation to internal surveillance of other countries and the use of Five Eyes for nefarious purposes. But the reality is that whichever president gets in, those Five Eyes arrangements are kind of post-colonial white settler relics, and we need to start thinking of other ways of gathering intelligence.
Interesting. Trump has had a relatively standoffish approach to the Pacific, which, alongside a surge in conservative and authoritarian or populist politics, has also seen many Pacific communities turn towards non-traditional partners such as China. What are the likely impacts of the election on this sort of expansive yet climate-threatened region?
I mean, well, in the first place, Trump has indicated high levels of envy and jealousy of New Zealand's and possibly Australia's and South Korea's way of dealing with the coronavirus. He's sort of kind of almost charged us with fake news in relation to our own stats on that. So I think that the pandemic, insofar as it will still be raging at the end of the year, I think that will be an area where Biden will certainly want to learn from the success stories in the Asia Pacific region and in New Zealand in particular. In relation to all of the autocrats in the region, Biden is not going to provide any comfort to Kim Jong-un, and hopefully won't provide comfort to Duterte either. They're going to have some interesting challenges in relation to the new Thai democratic movement and its opposition to the monarchy there. But in relation to Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, Biden's really going to have to start thinking again, what is the role of all of these countries, including Australia, New Zealand, there in their Indo-Pacific grand strategy. And Trump had no clues. He has absolutely no idea about what's either happening in the region, nor what the region consists of, and nor how pluralistic and complex it is. So I think Biden will, as they make and he will have to make a much deeper Asian pivot, he's going to have to begin thinking about new sorts of relationships and new ways of resetting the kind of American role in the region.
Yeah, as you mentioned before, Trump has made significant cuts to the State Department, which has included its non-military sort of peace apparatus and Peace Corps. What have been the impacts of these actions for peace efforts and development efforts across the Pacific region?
The USIP, the United States Institute for Peace, has been hanging on a thread for the last 4 years. I was with the president of the USIP just after Trump was elected, and his first inclination was to actually completely take it out of the budget. So they had to redirect their energies towards state building and a more military orientation to security in order to guarantee their funding. So Biden will be a much less sectarian patron of the U.S. Institute for Peace. In relation to the Peace Corps and overseas development system generally, Biden understands that this soft power is America's secret weapon in terms of influence and making sure that it has good friendships and good relationships with other countries. So I'm sure you'll see an increase in assistance into America's aid agencies. In relation to the Peace Corps itself, that also was under initial threat from the administration, but then the U.S. Senate came out in defense of it as a sort of a sacred cow. And so I mentioned Biden will definitely enlarge its scope and certainly try and redeploy Peace Corps members to the Pacific and the Southeast Asia as well.
Thank you for your time.
And that was Professor Kevin Clements of the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. So obviously some interesting insights there about how Trump has impacted Pacific communities and peace and development efforts in Southeast Asia and the wider Pacific. Next up, we're going to talk to Melissa about sort of more personal insights about how the peoples and cultures and communities, rather than just the states, have been affected by Trump's administration. So, Melissa, how has Trump's foreign policy impacted Pacific politics and cultures? Has it been more or less of Obama's?
So Trump's policies has impacted Pacific politics very adversely. Look at what they've done look what the US has done with Guam, for example. The Chamorro indigenous people of Guam have experienced like 400 years of colonization at the hands of the Spanish, Japanese, and the Americans. In 2020, Indigenous people in Guam still endure colonial violence as their rights are violated daily. Only last week, Trump shut down any possibility of statehood, independence, or even a plebiscite in Guam. Just in 2017, North Korea made Guam their target for threatened nuclear weapons and got to within a couple of days of readiness of the proposed launch. And Guam was stuck in between that due to Trump and his typical politics. And if Trump is to continue his presidency and really take that precedence in the South Pacific, there is a massive question in regards to what does that mean for our small regions what does that mean for our small regions if they are to engage in a similar situation to Guam, where they're going to be stuck between this foreign aid war between China and the US? And I understand that Guam is an unincorporated territory of the US. However, it's still a country in the North Pacific region and a prime example of what Trump's policies and politics can result in, which is like potential harm for these small regions. Perspectives to consider for Trump that I will happy to say that I don't agree with is that, Trump's administration has provided a shared reliance on a network of military allies, and that would help provide aid in the Pacific. This provides another option for Pacific nations to work with as a counter for China's influence in the region. Trump's administration gives Pacific states options in terms of allegiances and perhaps trade partnerships, although it's getting riskier with both the US and China becoming quite confrontational and potentially the Pacific getting caught in the middle. Trump's more aggressive approach brings accountability on a global scale around China's lack of transparency and its military expansion in the Pacific to human rights issues in mainland China.
Excellent, very interesting. I think what you've spoken about there speaks to a lot of what we were speaking before with rules-based order and multilateralism. Obviously, one thing that makes the Pacific such a geostrategic location as being fought over by China and Taiwan in the 80s and 70s through checkbook diplomacy and state recognition. And now, again, with the US and China hedging their fleets and armadas outside. And we had the Pacific pivot in 2010 from President Obama, which may or may not have led to anything. I think all of these show us how important the Pacific is as a people, and New Zealanders have this close affiliation with it. A lot of our people come from the Pacific. We have large communities sharing remittances back to their family and whānau back home. All of that's super important. But is it just tokenism? Do you think that Biden would improve on Trump's rhetoric or not? And would he actually affect actions that help them?
I'd say they don't still differ nearly enough. We need to make sure that we don't make the same mistake with Biden that we did with Obama, which is we kind of wasted the entire first term trusting him to do the right move in terms of we just expected a lot more from Obama, and to be honest, he was a bit ghost for the first term. But in saying that, what Biden has said so far points to a more multilateral approach that places greater emphasis on alliances and less reliant on tariffs and arms sales. This is a bit concerning for New Zealand and for Māori, as concerns about USA joining the CPTPP and what that will mean for things like intellectual property. Biden supported the deal, now known as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, as part of the former President Barack Obama's administration. They did say during a Democratic primary debate last year that he would insist on negotiating pieces of the pact. Biden does present opportunities for more traditional methods of foreign aid, centred more around humanitarian support, climate change, and I guess liberal values that we haven't seen from Trump. But Biden also has this focus on human rights versus battle with China. But, you know, what that could look for the Pacific is potentially more funding into Pacific forums and using soft power and more aid money and to balance China's influence. But I guess perspectives for Biden, just to be fair, Biden's administration may take a similar tack to Obama's with a focus on bilateral trade with the Pacific region and perhaps a shift back to the Middle East and reinstate the US as more of a moral authority in the world. Because Obama did do well to rebuild alliances and multilateral relationships with nations that the US hasn't historically engaged with. However, I'm sure with Biden, he'll do his best to rebuild that up again as Trump has sort of come in and destroyed that a bit. But culturally, in the Pacific, Trump is a favourite. Pacific belief systems and values influence the way in which they vote. And they must see themselves represented in a leader. And I guess with Trump, he offers what, you know, the whole perspective of what you see is what you get, which is, you know, cool transparency in some way. And for the Pacific people, that's what they want in a leader. And Trump is also quite open about his, you know, right-wing views around conservatism and his views in disregard to like gay rights and family planning and abortion reform. And for Pacific people who are really a strong region of Christians, having someone like him speak that way on a platform so openly sort of encourages them to be able to openly state their own beliefs, you know, in a time where religion is often challenged when that can bring harm onto others. And so I think Trump offers that opportunity for them to result back to that type of rhetoric, which is often, you know, which isn't helpful for anyone in society. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I mean, it's almost the way that the peace complex of America has changed, sort of reverting back to the missionary status almost of going in and sharing these cultural norms, which are almost putting countries backwards, is really quite problematic. So thank you very much for those insights. I think we touched a little bit on China and the US and the way that they're hedging against each other and the Pacific affects each other. I wanted to pass the camera back to Kate and ask, the United States has obviously just released their Pacific Pledge. How might that impact things? Would both Biden and Trump sign on to that? Give us a little bit of insight there.
So the Pacific Pledge is the 2020 sort of budget that they put towards Pacific Islands, and the State Department. It's quite interesting in the way that it's worked recently, because we do see it, and I think Charlotte touched on it before, Emily's touched on it, Melissa's touched on it. Trump says a lot of things, but what's actually going on behind the scenes is really, really interesting. So in that Pacific Pledge, for example, we've seen an extra $200 million be injected into the Pacific Islands and Pacific region. That's despite the US seemingly removing itself from institutions that sort of support the liberal democratic order. So we're seeing some of that money actually going directly into those areas. And I find it interesting because the Pacific Pledge breaks down into 3 points, right? So you've got your economic pillar, you've got your governance pillar, and you've got your security pillar. The economic pillar is 69.8 million. This is, I believe, in USD. And the governance pillar is just 3.7 and security is 5.1. What you see in the economic pillar, and this is where I think rhetoric's really interesting, is you see a mixture of female empowerment, you see a mixture of climate change policy, and you also see a mixture of, I would call it, security policy within that. And I do think it is a response to what's happening in China. And I think what we're seeing is that the US doesn't want to overtly say we're coming in to compete, but what you are seeing is increasing presence in that region. I think a good example, just maybe for the viewers around the world, was in the last coup in Fiji, for example. New Zealand pulled out and said we're not going to fund until this coup is over. China continued to invest in Fiji, and the US built a larger embassy. So what you're seeing with the Pacific Pledge is that the US is saying, right, well, if China's going to be investing in here, we're going to look towards, for example, a lot of sustainable initiatives for energy, for water sanitation. I mentioned female empowerment before. And it's a new approach, I think, to what we've seen in the past, which is where here's some money, this is what it's going towards, this is what it is. It's more broad. And I think given that that's a Trump administration State Department, you're looking at Pompeo there, that could be really interesting for Biden to carry on. Speculatively and traditionally, Democrats tend to broaden that net even further. So maybe what we see with Biden is even more injection in there. Again, that's speculation. But touching on what Melissa said before, I think it's really interesting that, it started off in 2019 as we're going to put 100 million into Pacific, and then it became double that. And that's because of COVID. But I think that's because there is a recognition now that the Pacific isn't just a voting bloc, but they need to be respected in a way that they haven't been before. And that comes down to that red carpet diplomacy. China opened not just checkbook, but they put on the works. I would be happy to say New Zealand tends to be lax on that front for a while when Pacific Island nation leaders came across. And I think now you start seeing even the UK as well, the US, UK, New Zealand saying, okay, we're going to put on that red carpet diplomacy for you too.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Interesting comment, and especially about Fiji. I think, in some ways, New Zealand might have been scared off it, considering the comparable size of its army.
Yeah.
But I think you did speak about a few points there, especially regarding the amount of aid that's going into the Pacific. And I think it's quite interesting, especially New Zealand aid, with the shift. And I believe the early 2000s, or it could be the mid 2000s, where the aid portfolio went back into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and all of a sudden you had a much closer link with business development. And so much of the aid that New Zealand gives to Pacific communities is for business-related practices, which inevitably we, to some extent, end up benefiting from. And so sometimes, and perhaps to draw on some of what Charlotte was saying before, it seems incompatible with many of the challenges that the Pacific are facing. Would you agree with that, Charlotte? Or
yeah, totally. There's kind of two sides to that debate, right? Because I could sit here and say that that aid shouldn't be, targeted toward businesses, and that it should be taking a more sustainable form. 100% for the, I don't know, it's top of my head, but Pacific Islands to institute solar panels. But then along that's a very kind of, it's that whole North versus South debate within climate change where, is it hypocritical for us to say that like the Pacific Islands, has to do things differently to how we've done it in the past? I think potentially, but then at the same time, there is definitely something to be said in making aid sustainable, and because that is 60% of our portfolio from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs is towards the Pacific Islands. So there's definitely like two sides of that coin, but it's about finding the balance. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, and we'll go back to that in our next section, because we're about to watch our final interview with Professor Lisa Ellis of the Otago University Politics Department. And she's going to discuss how Trump has impacted climate change responses, again, within that setting of multilateralism and New Zealand, which we'll then pick up after the interview. So Professor Lisa Ellis of the Politics Department.
Hello, now we are joined by Lisa Ellis, an environmental political theorist, and we are going to be talking about how the US election affects climate politics and climate change in general. So the first question I have is just quite a broad one about how the Trump administration has impacted on international climate responses and the world's response to climate change in general.
Oh, thanks, Charlotte. So you would think that Trump has made it safe for everybody, just a free ride on other people's climate reduction. And of course, in some cases, that has been true. it's certainly easier for people in the United States to justify their lack of reduction of emissions due to the leadership vacuum at the center. But surprisingly, I think there are things that have happened during the Trump administration that have actually been cause for optimism about the global climate emission reduction effort. For example, thanks to Trump, nobody can pretend that the climate emission reality is the result of an apolitical free market system. He's put paid to that.
Yeah.
He's been talking about a rigged system for 4 years. He's been very explicit about the role that his administration would like to play in determining the direction of the economy. And so now we have the way clear for a realistic discussion, unfettered by fairy tales about free market distribution. Of course, withdrawing from the Paris Accords is a serious disaster. Fortunately, other states have stepped up, and super states. We have better than status quo effort on the part of the European Union. There are sub-state efforts in the United States, a couple of coalitions in some states, and even coalitions of private actors are doing emission reduction, whatever the central government says. And I fully expect the newly revealed climate environment to smooth the way for international progress in this area.
Now that the US has kind of taken a step back, how do you think that's affected New Zealand's mitigation?
Well, it certainly affected our discourse.
Yeah.
The fast follower idea, I think, was always a mistake. You can divide the world into teams of 5 million, and those teams all have a role to play in the cooperation necessary to reduce emissions. And more than that, New Zealand has a disproportionately high obligation because our per capita emissions are so high compared to most of the rest of the world. So it is a lazy discourse to say, well, the US is out, what difference can we make? In fact, I think New Zealand can make an enormous difference. And the biggest difference I'm hoping to see from this next government has to do with foreign policy leadership of just the sort that only New Zealand can lead. So I think our best hope for the kind of aggressive emissions reduction that we need in the context of semi-anarchy is what I like to call clubs of the willing.
Right.
And if you build a club of the willing and you make it attractive enough to be a member of that club, others will see that it's in their interest to join it. You have a sort of combination of bottom-up pressure from people who are suffering from the effects of climate and top-down recognition that it's in your national interest to join. The Montreal Protocol was motivated by a combination of goodwill and the advantages of early adoption. And there's no reason that New Zealand can't put together a similar coalition.
And sort of transform its position from a fast follower to a leader in global climate politics.
Yeah, I mean, we're obliged to do not only because of our per capita emissions, but also because of our role in the Pacific.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
And you see that when the discourse in countries most affected by sea level rise is about, sometimes it's about migration with dignity, other times it's about control over their own future. It's must be absolutely maddening to be among the least responsible communities on Earth and among the most vulnerable. And it's the thing that New Zealand can do for our Pacific partners is to vindicate their agency, not treat them like victims.
And that was Professor Lisa Alice of Otago University Politics Department, bringing up some interesting points there on Trump's impact on climate change. Now, over to Emily. I would just like to ask you, in more detail perhaps, or with some examples, how has Trump impacted climate change and the world's response to climate change? And how is that likely to change perhaps under Biden?
I think it's quite interesting because climate change has clearly been quite a defining issue in this election, and Trump has not shied away from making his stance known. He's consistently undermined global climate action and downplayed the dangers of climate change throughout his first term, he has supported and boasted the fossil fuel industry and encouraged gas, oil, and coal exploration. He's also rolled back or repealed 125 rules which were aimed at protecting the environment,
Yeah. Okay, so that's had, I mean, he's had a significant impact, obviously, by pulling out of the climate accords, by changing the EPA, by putting business leaders into environmental protection agencies that are designed to protect people. Obviously, during this election, we've seen lots and lots of talk about fracking, especially in Pennsylvania, which I don't believe has been called yet, but was a bit of a contentious state between Biden and Trump. Trump obviously puts his middle where his mouth is and loves businesses and supports them over climate change. Do you think Biden would really flip the tables on that? Do you think he would make the hard choices that need to be made?
I would hope so. It's quite hard to say, but I think compared to what Trump has done in almost slowing and stopping climate mitigation, Biden would. Trump has consistently campaigned off the costs of climate policies, but it makes no sense to just completely look at the cost of action and ignore the cost of inaction. Biden is the complete opposite when it comes to his approaches to climate change. He's consistently said that it is a human emergency which requires rapid overhauling of America's energy system, and his climate plan shows this. Although obviously it is just a plan at this stage, who's to see how the election's going to go, but it proposes $2 trillion for this clean energy revolution, and it not only helps with the transition to clean energy, but it protects workers and communities in this transition, because obviously it's going to be quite a tumultuous period for a lot of people. And I think that in itself speaks for itself on what Biden would, I would hope he would stick to the plan.
Yeah. Yep, the Socialist Green Manifesto, as it was called, I believe, by Trump.
He did distance himself. Biden did distance himself from that, but obviously Trump still said that's what it was, so it could have fooled a lot of people. Who's to know?
And I mean, his sort of paradoxical support, continual support of fracking and things like that sort of show the political decisions that he's having to make to try and get ahead of that curve. We were talking before, Charlotte, actually, we were talking about climate change in the Pacific to a certain degree and the rules-based order, and obviously the Pacific is immensely affected by climate change. What's the take for you about these two different potential presidents and how they might impact the response from Pacific communities?
Well, just to start off, to lay the background framework for just about climate change, human-induced warming reached approximately 1 degree above pre-industrial levels in 2017, with high confidence that there's going to be an increasing rate of 0.2 degrees per decade. Now, this amounts to, it's quite a broad estimation, but global mean sea level projections are expected to rise between 9 to 88 centimeters, which is obviously hugely tragic in relation to the Pacific, as countries such as Kiribati and Tuvalu have been expected to go underwater by 2050. The central moral tragedy of this dilemma is how causes and consequences are unlinked and ununiform, whereby despite the Pacific's extremely negligible, it's a hard word to say, negligible contribution in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, 0.04% to be exact. They are facing they're carrying the brunt of the burden in terms of global climate politics. This isn't the first time that the Pacific Islands have been absorbed into the negative side effects of strategic Western self-interest, such as colonization, phosphate mining, and nuclear testing. However, many commentators have argued that obviously the global phenomenon of climate change is the most dangerous threat thus far. Though often framed as the most pressing climate concern is sea level rise. However, additional impacts include increasing temperature, shifting rainfall patterns, saltwater intrusion, intensifying storms and cyclones, all of which affect the daily well-being and livelihoods of Pacific Islanders. However, since the 1990s, Pacific Island leaders have been calling for developed Western states to shift their economies away from reliance upon fossil fuels. However, we see the response from the big polluters such as US, China, Russia, are taking, their response comes more in the form of providing adaptation aid to Pacific Island countries, as Kate's touched on the $200 million Pacific Pledge, of which 10 million of that is dedicated towards, I said it's not very detailed, but something about building climate resilience. Along the same vein, in 2019, Jacinda Ardern announced a $300 million global climate support package, of which half of that is dedicated directly towards the Pacific. That comes in providing infrastructure such as tanks, seawalls, education, whatnot. But importantly, I would argue that adaptation measures are pretty defunct if not paired in tandem with extensive mitigation efforts. I'm no engineer, but I don't see any seawall being able to keep out 88 centimeters of sea level rise. That's just the reality. And that would happen if these polluting countries carried on as business as usual. Additionally, a great little tool, which you can find online, is the Climate Action Tracker, which is an independent scientific analysis which tracks government's climate action, whereby New Zealand's current emissions mitigations has been deemed as insufficient, whereas the US has been deemed as critically insufficient, meaning that if all countries were to emit the same amounts, that global warming would exceed 4 degrees by the end of the decade. However, this sounds all very like doom and gloom, which it is to some extent, but many Pacific Island leaders have taken a strong leadership role in fighting this narrative that they are victims of climate change. One of my favorite examples is former Prime Minister of Tuvalu, Inele Sopoaga, where he says at the 2019 Pacific Islands Forum, in an opening statement addressed to Prime Minister Scott Morrison, he said, "You are trying to save your economy, I am trying to save my people." Another great example of climate resistance activism is the Pacific Climate Change Warriors Group, a youth-led grassroots organization across 17 Pacific Island nations, linked to the umbrella organization 350.org, where they oppose this narrative that relocation is the only possible adaptation scenario. Their central message being, we are not drowning, we are fighting. But just to piggyback on Melissa's earlier points, it's interesting with a large proportion of Pacific Islanders feeling more connected to Trump's conservative points, what kind of conflict that will bring about.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Some interesting comments there. I think a lot of what I've read and some of the narratives coming out from the Pacific, you know, solutions from bigger countries like Australia and New Zealand, such as, you know, well, eventually we'll have to house these people. They're not on the dot because these are people's homes, their livelihoods. Likewise, you know, seawalls, you know, if they hire Trump's contractors, the ones that built the Mexican wall, that's obviously not going to help much either. So the Pacific is obviously something that's going to be greatly affected, not only by extreme weather events, but also by things like overfishing. Now, New Zealand plays quite a large role in monitoring the exclusive economic zones of Pacific countries in partnership with the United States and Australia and various other sort of Five Eyes powers. That was difficult to get out. But Kate, I just wanted to ask you briefly, what do you see these impacts of food security, the EEZ, and how that follows into this capacity of Pacific cultures?
So I think the first point, and it's just to draw on something that Charlotte made before, the thing about the perspective that we're taking is that we're looking at the US election from a foreign policy perspective. And one of the advantages of having a foreign policy perspective is that foreign policy can be long-term. It doesn't have to be short-term. And I think the thing with climate change is that for so long, it's been an unattractive policy to address. But now with, I guess, because it is so urgent, governments can respond in a foreign policy way with long-term solutions. So when it comes to overfishing and food security, one of the things I find really interesting is that the United States in their 2020 pledge released 17 million for USAID, which is the Disaster Resilience in Compact Nations pledge. And that's really interesting because that covers a whole range of issues that come within climate change. And I think it picks up on what Emily and Charlotte have been saying, which is that when it comes to these things, we're looking at, particularly from foreign policy, we're looking at picking up the pieces. We're not looking at addressing the root causes. And I think that there's a potential now with the Trump administration and the Biden administration to respond to these issues with the root cause, solution. And that can be, one example is China's pledge to be carbon neutral by 2060. I don't know how feasible that is, but that should be, I think, in terms of the Trump administration, he's competitive with China. So he should be looking, I would have said, at something that's competitive in terms of his climate response. When it comes to food shortages, you can look in Pacific Island nations and say, right, how are we going to make sure that we're not overfishing? Species are dying because the waters are getting warmer, so livelihoods are at stake here. And I think there's a real potential for US in particular to take a leadership approach with Five Eyes, but also with Pacific Island nations as well, because it's not enough just to be the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff anymore, but you can take a leadership role. And I think what's also going to play into that is that the way in which China provides aid, there's a point where, Pacific Island nations are under pressure to pay this back. How are you going to provide aid as well that's going to make sure that these island nations aren't caught up in that debt trap, essentially, because that's also going to, contribute to food shortages if these people continue to live in poverty. That's just a simple fact, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting point there on paying it back. I mean, a lot of loans obviously given out by China, it writes them off and then builds a new deep sea naval base or builds a stadium or something like that and says, it's all no worries. And New Zealand starts to panic. I'm just wondering, Melissa, would you be able to give us perhaps any insight on whether or not how Pacific countries plan on paying these back, if they do at all, or whether or not something like a country like New Zealand might just have to accept that the role that these communities play are so central to itself, to its own nationhood, that perhaps we should forgive them as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when you find out what the plan is, let me know, because I think a lot of us are still trying to figure that out. But I think China has really become this, I'm going to say like a economic colonizer in some way, in terms of knowing that they're the only ones showing up with money. In order for us to have South Pacific Games, they show up with the money for the stadiums. In order for us to have event centres that could hold a massive amount of people, they're showing up with that money. And for Pacific people, that means expressing their culture and their sense of belonging to the tourist industry. That means that they can have the South Pacific Games and have all these other countries come along to it. So China's here waving all this money, and I guess for the US, regardless if it's Biden or Trump, it's like, who's going to show up to that and be able to, I guess, not give as much money, but show them a different way or a different way of working, a strategic way of working where they don't have to constantly get themselves into these battles with settlements that we're not able to pay. And then I guess for New Zealand, for us, it's more so with the current Pacific Reset strategy that they have, which is supposed to help, I guess, the neighbouring Pacific regions become more stable in terms of their businesses and a lot of the health sort of organisations they have on floor is, when is the rhetoric going to change from just, the normal aiding stuff that we do to this is the sort of stuff we want to do to address China and US's, current presence in the Pacific. And I know they can't, stand aside them and say we're just as strong as you, but at least if the action isn't there, the rhetoric is changing. And I feel like that's the hope that the Pacific need from New Zealand and their current foreign aid work in the Pacific. Yeah. Excellent. That's my personal opinion, by the way.
Wow, yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. Some interesting comments. Liam, I'm wondering, you've got quite a hand on the pulse of New Zealand's current and future, perhaps, policies around climate change in the Pacific. Do you have any insights? Do you agree?
Yeah, so obviously at the start of the year, a lot of countries were affected by, all countries were affected by COVID-19. So here in New Zealand, we had to redesign our budget, actually, our 2020 budget, and make it COVID focused, and make it recovery focused. And as we've talked about earlier, in our region, climate change is huge. You know, our brothers and sisters in the Pacific are sinking. And we need to take action, and we need to be leaders about that. And as our Prime Minister said, you know, we've done a lot, but there's still a lot more to do. So what we did is we made a focus on our budget to make sure that, okay, we're tackling it and we're recovering from COVID, but we're having a future focus as well. So we're going to have a three-pronged approach, and we're going to be tackling our long-term issues. So that involves our, in part of our COVID recovery will be our environmental recovery, tackling that environmental degradation. You know, we have problems with wilding pines here in New Zealand. We've got a billion trees program in New Zealand, where we're planting a billion trees around New Zealand, preferably native trees. But we've planted 248 million of those in the last couple of years, which has been incredible. But making sure that we have a future focus, and whether or not we'll see that out of our president, whatever president will be elected, will be interesting to have a look at, because we've invested in a lot of things, from our water quality issues all across our country. We've seen degradation of water quality, and not just in rural areas, but also in urban areas. We've got a new minister working on Three Waters, and she is also a foreign minister, which has just been announced yesterday here in New Zealand, which is quite interesting to see that how will those mix? You know, when she's overseas, will she learn from mistakes or learn from improvements overseas? But here in New Zealand, we've committed a lot of money in our COVID recovery to our environmental recovery as well, making sure that our environment in New Zealand is an asset that underpins our identity and our well-being here. And I think that's something innate that we grow up in New Zealand, and that's something that we recognise. And it's not something that we've seen globally as well. We haven't seen world leaders take a strong stance on this. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those comments. I mean, you mentioned the planting the trees, and a lot of these sorts of initiatives come from private businesses. And it's something that Charlotte sort of brought up before as well, about private sector responses. And we've heard it from our own sort of Justin Pepperton, a famous New Zealand documentary maker. He's also discussed the ways in which, you know, perhaps Amazon could get into the climate accords because the United States isn't, and perhaps that's a way of circumventing that. Do we actually think that businesses that sort of derived in the capitalist system can actually make a significant impact in responding to climate change? That's sort of an open question, I realise.
Yeah. I think when you have a government that's not doing enough, I think the private sector will come into play, and whether that happens is free market will balance that out or not. That's still to see. But I think private businesses do have a role to play. And in New Zealand, we had a $1.1 billion package that was giving funding out to a lot of our private sector companies that were doing a lot of work on water quality and planting trees. A lot of that was done through NGOs or private companies that were getting grants from the government. So we've seen that in New Zealand. I haven't seen a lot of it done in the US, and definitely not through public funding. But has anyone else?
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your comments. I'm being told that we sort of have to wrap things up a little bit here and head back to the Wales studio. So before we go, I'd like to thank all of my panelists. I'd like to thank the special guests that agreed to be interviewed beforehand, and our fantastic tech team here that made the studio available to us. So thank you very much for this absolutely wonderful opportunity. Hopefully when we come out of here, the election results aren't something to make us cry. But back to you, Wales. Thank you.